And qualitative research skills in academic writing skills of young Georgian scholars. And another aim is to raise collaboration between Georgian scholars and US peers, and to increase the interaction the academic staffs and researchers and mentor and coach Georgian scholars for publishing research papers in Georgian and Western academic peer-reviewed journals in STEM fields. This mini-series courses is in 5th in row, and we covered many topics, starting from the US education system, funding agencies, and other funding opportunities. We covered projects related to how to write the grant proposal, etc. We covered topics related to the scientific publications and the plagiarism and other stuff. And now, today, we have two distinguished speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Regis Comperda, Assistant Professor, San Diego State University, and her presentation topic is Scientific Methodology and Approaches, Experimental Design, Statistical Rigor, Quantitative and Qualitative Approaches. And another presenter is Dr. Brianna Quintero, and the topic for presentation is Communication Skills in US and Georgian University Context. So this is very interesting, and I was the person who asked in person Brianna to prepare some slides which shows the differences between presentation skills and communication used in the United States and in Georgia. So with this kind of short introduction, I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Rochelle to say a couple of welcoming remarks. Walt, floor is yours.
Thank you for that nice introduction, Nodar. Yeah, I'd just like to welcome everybody. This is the last in our series of mini courses. We apologize for having it after the academic year. It's clearly hard for people to make it at this time. And in the US, the day after 4th of July, which is also a impediment. In any case, thanks for being here. We've got two great talks today, and this will be the end of the series. Dean Guven, I will be on the line later and hopefully explain a bit about the certificate of attendance for those of you that have completed the majority of the courses. So we'll have the presentation. Submit any questions or comments you have as we go along in the chat. Dr. Surgaladze will collate those and package them and direct the discussion and questioning, and we'll post any answers that we don't get to online. So welcome. This, as I say, is our last series. Next big effort is to host PhD students from Georgia in the US to do part of the research at San Diego State University. So we're working on that now. Most of you should know about that. Our first speaker, as Dr. Surgaladze said, is Dr. Regis Comperda. I'm really looking forward to her talk. She works in this area, is submitting an NSF grant in the area now, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to learn. I'm personally very interested in this topic of experimental design and statistical rigor and reproducibility. I mean, science is really producing something that anybody can check, can duplicate, and should come up with the same results. If they don't, then that's a basis for further research and discussion. That is not the way science is done everywhere, as many of you know, but for us, it's a key part that the work is absolutely clear how it's done, can be reproduced and checked, and there's no question that the results are solid and consistent. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Comperda. Welcome. Thanks for giving this presentation.
Thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak about this. As you'll hear me talk about later, exactly this idea of open science and reproducibility and being able to share and build off of other people's work, I think is really a foundation of, how science gets better and how we work as a field. So excited to talk about that. Should I go ahead and share screen?
Yeah, please.
All right. I think I will need permission.
One minute and I'm doing it, okay? Sorry.
Sure.
You can do it now, I guess.
Okay.
Thanks, Anna.
All right. How is that looking? Are we able to see the slides?
Looks great.
Perfect. It's always the scariest part of doing these Zoom talks is you never know what the other person is seeing. Okay, so again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak with you all today about kind of a lot of topics, right? So under the main umbrella of scientific methodology and approaches. So we're going to look at some of the specific details inside of that today. So what I do want to start with is a land acknowledgement. So I am here in San Diego. So the land that I am on and the land that San Diego State University on is the traditional land of the Kumeyaay people. And I just want to take a few moments for you to read that acknowledgement and honor that land with me. Okay, thank you for that. So as I mentioned, the general theme of my talk today is about scientific methodology and approaches. I'm going to start by talking about experimental design, and kind of within experimental design is this idea of different approaches you might use to your research, so qualitative and quantitative. And then if you're doing quantitative research, this idea of statistical rigor, so how am I going to analyze my data, and different types of approaches you might take. Are you going to be doing novel cutting edge science? Or are you going to be doing confirmatory type science? And then after that, we'll spend the next portion of the talk discussing the idea of reproducibility of results, or this idea of kind of transparency in how we communicate science. So I want to first start by giving you a little bit of context about me. So I am an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at San Diego State University. I was trained as a chemist. That's what my degrees are all in. But in parallel, I also have a strong background in education. So I was initially trained to be a high school teacher, teaching 11th and 12th grade chemistry and physics. I have a master's degree in chemistry education, and then I went back for a PhD in chemistry education. So at all points in my career, these strands of chemistry and education have been intertwined and parallel. So trained to do the chemistry side, but also trained to think about how people teach and learn chemistry. So as a result of that, I am also a member of the Center for Research in Mathematics and Science Education at San Diego State University, where I work with people who do similar education work in math, biology, physics, that sort of things. And I am also the graduate advisor for our Mathematics and Science Education doctoral program, which is another joint PhD with UC San Diego. And so these are really the themes you're going to see when I talk about research, because this is what my research group focuses on, is what do we know about the intersection of chemistry and education, and how do we put these pieces together? So when I talk about kind of overall research trends, or I talk about, developing a research question, it'll come from that background for me, but I really encourage you to think about how your own research fits into these topics that we're talking about. So let's start with the scientific method. This is maybe the first way that a lot of us were introduced to science, is learning about what the scientific method is. And I've seen a lot of different ways the scientific method has been communicated. I think back when I first learned it, it was very much like a straight line from you do an observation, you come up with a question, you try to collect data, you answer your question, you're done. And I think more modern interpretations of the scientific method have really embraced the idea that it's not a linear process, right? There's kind of a circular aspect to it. We might still start with an observation. We might still be coming up with questions. We'll kind of come up with a hypothesis or an explanation for that behavior. And then we want to have some way to predict if that explanation works. We need to gather data, and then, we might refine our hypothesis. If we collect enough data, we can generate theories, and the process starts again. And I think that this diagram, though overly complicated, does a nice job trying to explain that there's a lot of moving parts in doing science. But I also think it leaves out some really critical steps. So, for example, how do I gather data? Where are my data coming from? Data don't just magically appear generally. And if you have data that magically appear, I'd really like to talk to you, because this is usually the most painful part of doing science, right? So I think there's some pieces missing here, which is if you have a testable prediction, well, you have to plan some sort of experiment or data collection so that you have the data to test your prediction. And the reason for the distinction between experiment or data collection, we'll talk about a little bit, but experiment generally implies that you're doing something with like a treatment or a control group, whereas there are other ways to collect data that might not be a true experiment. So I've got my data, and then I have to do something with them, right? I have to analyze them. The data generally don't come to you pre-analyzed. You get a big messy pile of data, and it's up to you as the researcher to make sense of that in some way. And so that's the analysis that you need to do. And then after that, you still have to communicate it. It's not enough for you to just do the analysis on your own and keep it on your computer or keep it locked in a file cabinet, right? Sharing is the important part of science. If it doesn't get out in the world, we can never get back to developing these general theories. It's very rare for scientific theories to advance because of the work of a single person, right? Science is this community effort, this cumulative generation of knowledge. And in order to generate that knowledge, we have to be able to communicate our methods and our results with other people. So that's the main thing that I am going to be talking about today, is kind of these missing pieces of that diagram of the scientific method. So we're going to start talking about planning your experiments, what kinds of data collection tools you might use. Then we'll talk about statistical methods for analyzing quantitative data, and we'll finish up talking about this idea of communicating your methods and your results. All right, so let's talk about different approaches to experimental design. So there's a couple of terms here that I'm going to go through and explain. So the main ways we categorize research approaches are as qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And I've kind of set them there so you can think of it like a continuum, with qualitative on one side, quantitative on the other, and mixed methods being exactly what it implies, kind of a mix of the two in the center. So the approach that you're going to choose to use is going to be related to the goals of your research. If you have research goals that are really just to describe a situation, understand someone's lived experiences, explore a phenomenon, you're likely to be using qualitative methods. If, on the other hand, you want to actually get some numerical data because you want to do some comparisons, you want to look at some relationships, you want to look at change over time or change across groups, or you want to make some sort of prediction, then you're more likely to be using quantitative methods. And again, mixed methods is really just a mix of this. You would integrate both the qualitative and the quantitative data to address your research goals. So what kind of instruments do you use? How would you collect data? And notice that I'm using instruments in a very broad sense, right? So those of us who are used to working in chemistry labs, we might have a sense of the instrument is that thing that sits on my lab bench, right? It's like my mass spec or something. But when we're talking in the more broad field, when I do education research, I think of an instrument as something like an interview protocol or a survey. So a very broad understanding of what an instrument might be. So in qualitative methods, our interviews might be doing these interviews, observing people, surveys with open-ended questions where people can write, sentences about their feelings, or you might have some sort of artifact, like you're looking at papers or you're looking at videos. Quantitative, again, you can use a survey, but it tends to be closed-ended questions. So this is someone would agree or disagree with a statement, or maybe there's a test that actually has a correct answer. Again, you could be doing observations, but generally you would be using those observations to turn it into a number, right? You're saying, oh, I counted the number of times something happened, something like that. Or you could just go straight to a database where all of that data already exists. In addition to that, how are we going to analyze it? So for qualitative data, what you're generally going to end up with is some sort of coding. So let's say you have an interview, you're going to have a transcript, so showing all of the things that people said, and you're going to start looking at that for themes or commonalities across people. And what your ultimate goal is in qualitative research is to be able to summarize, well, this is something that I saw in all of the cases, or here's a unique thing that I saw in these certain types of people. But the idea is that you're not going to present all of the interview, right? You're going to try to find pieces there that address your research goal, and you're going to code it in such a way that someone else can apply your codes. So you want to do this idea of kind of reproducibility, or if I tell someone that every time I saw this sentence, I coded it with this term, that they agree and they would code it the same way. And then for the quantitative, we'll talk a lot more today about statistical methods, but basically just ways to manipulate your numbers. Some of these have very specific names in terms of the types of methods. So if you do qualitative research, you'll hear things like grounded theory, case study, or narrative research. They all just describe different goals. So like a case study would be following a single individual or a very specific context to kind of give a rich description. Grounded theory is you're generally trying to take all of the information and generate a new theory or a new understanding of an event. For quantitative, so again, we talked about this idea of experimental. So experimental, there's a lot of different ways to design an experiment, and there's a reference down there on the bottom for in chemistry education, some of the methods we use when we're doing experimental design. Typically that involves like a treatment or control group because you're comparing things. We also have quasi-experimental designs because sometimes you can't make humans go into treatment and control groups, so you have to do it in other ways, or just general survey research. So you're just asking a question, you're trying to see what data are out there. Mixed methods, there's a lot of different ways you can combine quantitative and qualitative data. So convergent, meaning you're using both types of data to answer a question. Transformative generally means that you're trying to change something about the situation, and then you're going to look at the impact of the change you're making. Sequential, meaning you can choose if you do the quantitative first or the qualitative first, or you do them in opposite orders. But these are all research decisions you're going to want to make as you're planning how you're going to address your research goals. And then the last piece of this is just a summary. You know, the nice thing about qualitative is you get really rich, in-depth data. In general, that's the trade-off, is that you're getting smaller sample sizes. So you're not going to talk to hundreds of people. You'll talk to maybe 6, 7, but you'll get a really rich understanding. Quantitative, you can get a lot more samples, hundreds, thousands, which means you maybe don't get as much information from a single person, but it's much more generalizable because you're surveying a lot more people. And the benefit of mixed methods is you can kind of mix and match pieces of both to best benefit your research. So taking the best parts of quantitative, minimizing some of the bias associated with qualitative. But whatever you do, you need to plan your research design in advance. And so what's going to be really important is that whichever of those methods you select, it has to align with the research questions you're trying to answer and the hypotheses you have. So using an example from chemistry education, I might have a research question that says, what is the effect of instant polling devices, that we call clickers, on student learning? And so this is a pretty broad question. So what I need to do is I need to operationalize it. I need to figure out what is the actual specific thing I'm trying to measure. How am I going to demonstrate that I've answered this question? So essentially asking myself, what data do I need to satisfy myself that I have answered my research question? Do I want to do this using a qualitative approach? Do I want to interview students to understand their perceptions of clickers? Is the effect I'm looking at the effect on how the students perceive the class? Does it make the class more enjoyable? Does it make the class more frustrating? What information am I trying to get out there? Or maybe I want to go in a more quantitative direction. Maybe I want to see, well, what do the grades of students look like in a class that uses these clickers versus doesn't use these clickers? And both of those would still fall under this idea of the effect of clickers. It's my job to be much more specific in talking about what data am I going to collect to address this. You also need to think about the context. So am I even able to set up a treatment and control? A lot of times with education research, you don't have a choice over what students are in the class, and you can't randomly assign them to classes. But there are maybe ways to statistically control for something about the students coming into the class. You need to know how often you're going to do the treatment. So with clickers, is it something I'm doing every class? Is it something I'm only doing right before a test as a review? But all of these are research decisions and research design things you need to think about in advance. And again, when should the data be collected? Let's say that I'm using the clickers and I want to give a survey at the beginning of the class and a survey at the end of the class because I want to see how the student attitudes change. Well, we all know that the first week of class can be a lot of busy things happening, right? Technology doesn't always work right at the beginning. And so maybe you don't want to give your survey in the first week of class because you know the students are going to be frustrated with technology issues. So all of this goes into your research design, is you need to figure out what questions are you answering, and then how am I going to actually address those? When am I going to get the data? This is especially important because for a lot of types of research, you're going to need prior approval to do your data collection, particularly when you're collecting new data from human or animal subjects. So these are subject to regulations and reviews that require additional training and certificates. So for me and my students, we go through CITI, which is the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative. We complete these short courses, we take quizzes, and then we have these certificates that we have to provide every time we do a research project. We have to file our plans with our university, and someone reviews all of our research plans to make sure that our subjects and their data are treated ethically and within all appropriate guidelines. And so the main governing body for my research is an institutional review board, or an IRB. There are similar types of committees for people doing animal research. And then you may have seen, like, when you're visiting websites, the new GDPR guidelines for ethical treatment of data. This also applies to human subjects research data. And so even though this is a European thing, a lot of American research is complying with it because it's just easier to be overly compliant with all of the regulations rather than going back and having to fix something if you find that you're out of compliance. So this is another reason you're going to have to plan ahead, because you need to be able to communicate your research plan to someone else so that they can approve it. Okay, so let's say that I've got it approved, I'm ready to do my data collection. You need to make sure that you've selected data collection methods to minimize your error or your bias. So what does that mean? Well, for me, that means what instrument am I using to measure that variable? And again, you can think about that in a lab setting, like which of my piece of fancy lab equipment am I using? Or it could mean something as simple as what survey am I using? So first thing is, does something already exist? Is there already an instrument out there? Or maybe I'm measuring something that's never been measured before. Maybe I need to modify an existing instrument to work in a range that no one's ever used it in. Maybe I need to build something completely from scratch. That's an option as well. You also want to think about, are you going to need training? Is this something that you are just going to be able to pick up? Or is it really better to find an expert in the field and work with that expert so that the expert can collect the data and then you can just analyze it later? So these are all things to consider when designing your data collection. Again, this idea of timing. So we talked about, if I give my survey too early in the semester, students are still frustrated with technology, I might get bad data out. So it's not enough just to use a good instrument. I have to think very carefully about when I'm going to use that instrument to make sure I'm collecting data that aren't going to have bias in them. But regardless of what you decide, in addition to thinking about it before you select the instrument, after you collect the data, you have to have a way to demonstrate that the data you've collected are high quality. And so when we talk about high quality data, we're typically thinking in terms of the idea of measurement error. And so this is something we teach to, the first year university students in our chemistry labs, is this idea of systematic and random error. So first I'm going to talk to you about it, putting my chemistry hat on, so physical science. So when we talk about systematic error, we talk about this idea of accuracy, which is basically, let's say I've got this brand new thermometer. I want to see how accurate it is. I know what the normal boiling point of water is. I'm going to try to calibrate it against that known boiling point. So I use my thermometer and I say, the number that I got in my boiling water isn't what I know the true value for the boiling point of water to be, but there's an equation I can use and I can figure out what the error is associated with that measurement, right? I can calibrate it to figure out how accurate it is. But there's also not an expectation that if I use that thermometer 3 times in a row, I would get exactly the same value out. And that's okay. So we're used to this idea of quantifying precision or quantifying consistency in the values. So let's say I get those 3 different values. I could tell you something about the spread of those values, the standard deviation, the standard error, or the confidence intervals. So these are very basic ways that you would communicate to your audience something about the accuracy and the precision of the data that you've collected. And you need to be able to communicate that so people know if they can trust your work, essentially, right? If you tell them that all of my measurements were perfect, they're very unlikely to believe that. But if you can quantify your level of accuracy and precision, that makes people feel more confident in the analysis that you're doing. Now, we use a very similar approach to thinking about measurement error when we measure people as well. So when we measure people, it's referred to as psychometrics, but it's the exact same idea, is that I want to think about what's the systematic error and what's the random error. The thing that can be a little bit frustrating is we don't use the same words. So instead of talking about systematic error as accuracy, when we're measuring people, we refer to it as validity. And it gets a little bit harder to measure people because you can't calibrate to a known standard. So let's say I'm trying to measure someone's understanding of stoichiometry or their motivation to succeed in chemistry. There's no true value. So I can't say, oh, I gave you the survey, your score was a 3.5, but I know inside your head, I know you're really a 4, right? There's no good way for me to know what the true value is. So we have some more roundabout methods for establishing validity. And I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I just want you to know that it's a similar process, that you still have to establish this, even if you're measuring people using a survey. We also worry about random error. We don't call it precision, we call it reliability. And so you'll see people report this using things like test retest reliability. And as a little visualization of what test retest reliability is. So let's imagine I've got 2 groups of people. I'm measuring them at time 1 and time 2. And so you see that I've got a graph there. So the x-axis is the measurements at time 1. The y-axis is the measurements at time 2. If those measurements perfectly match, they would be exactly along that dotted line. So that dotted line is like a perfect match between time 1 and time 2. They might not perfectly match, but the closer they are to that line, the higher the value will be, up to a perfect correlation of 1. And so I can report that number and say, look, I gave this survey 2 times, a pre and a post. This is the correlation among those 2 time points. That's my test retest reliability. Unfortunately, humans are a little tricky to measure. It can be a lot of work to get the same people to answer your survey at 2 time points, right? So you may have caught them at time 1, but not at time 2. The other thing that's tricky about measuring humans is that they change, right? So if I gave a survey at the beginning of the semester and the end of the semester about their understanding of chemistry, I certainly hope that after a semester in my class, they understand more chemistry. So it might not be a fair comparison to look at their scores pre and post and try to call that test retest reliability, because I might have thought that the thing is going to change in the meantime. So there's a couple of other fancy ways you can talk about reliability, not involving this test retest idea. And so you may have seen these like the KR20 and 21 formulas, Chromebox Alpha, Omega, things like this. So the whole point of getting into the weeds here is that your field is going to have norms about how you communicate that your data really are measuring the things that they say they are. And that's what's important for you to know so that you can make sure you're communicating that with your audience. For me and my audience in chemistry education research, we work from the standards for educational and psychological testing. And these standards have some pretty specific language about how you demonstrate that what you're measuring is actually what you're measuring. And so the really important one is this idea of validity, this idea that you're constructing arguments and you're showing people evidence that this thing that I'm measuring is really what I'm measuring. And you provide as much evidence as possible so that your reader truly believes that your data represent what you want it to represent, which then means you can conduct your data analysis and your conclusions are sound. Similarly, for reliability, there's a lot of specific language here about things you can do for reliability, like correlations, but it all boils down to this idea that you're looking at consistency. So the main takeaway here is that sometimes this is complicated, right? And it can be a lot to expect a single person to have expertise in all of these areas. And something that I have been doing as part of my career is I have been working very hard to try to educate my community and try to kind of explain these things in terms that we're a little bit more familiar with. So this is just an example of 2 publications that I have, really trying to unpack these standards and explain to my field how we should be talking about our data, how we should be demonstrating validity, how we should be demonstrating reliability. And the thing that I realized after publishing these papers is that it's not always easy for people to sit down with the literature and figure out, well, what are best practices in my field? So one of my recently funded NSF projects is creating a centralized database to help people find instruments. And so again, I talked about this idea that in my field, instruments tend to mean surveys and things like that. It's a lot of work to go to the literature every time I want to measure something. So let's say that I really want to measure, students' motivation for chemistry. Well, I don't want to create a whole instrument from scratch, but I also don't want to read 20 papers to figure out what the best instrument is. So what this website that me and my colleagues are building called Chiral, the Chemistry Instrument Review and Assessment Library, what it's going to do is my team is going to do all of that reading for you. So we go search through the literature, we identify the instruments, we pull out information about them, and then we put it all in a single location. So it'll be searchable. like I want to know something about motivation, or I want to know something about how students understand gas behavior. It's going to tell you, has this instrument been translated into other languages? It's going to tell you what sort of evidence you've got for validity and reliability, kind of putting all of this information in a single place for you. And so, just in my field alone, we've identified over 200 publications which contain over 100 unique instruments. So there's a lot of information out there in the literature, and not all of it is as good as other information, and your fields all probably have something similar. And this is the idea, where science is a collaborative enterprise, right? We build on the work that other people have done. And so that's the sort of thing I would encourage you to look for. If you're doing a project in a new area for the first time, you're not really sure what the norms are in your field, you're not really sure how people communicate or select instruments, see if your field has put together any sort of centralized resource like this. I know there are things that exist like this in psychology. They've got the mental measurements yearbook, and other fields do things like this as well. So with that, I'm going to switch gears slightly to talk about statistical rigor. So now I'm kind of operating from an assumption that you've collected some quantitative data. So you're working with some sort of numbers, and you're trying to figure out how you want to analyze those numbers. So one statistical approach you're very likely to see is a frequentist approach, which uses null hypothesis significance testing. So this is kind of the traditional method of analysis that you might be familiar with. You develop a null hypothesis, which is basically, I expect to see no difference. You have an alternate hypothesis. I expect to see a difference. You can choose, I expect the difference to be greater, or I don't know where the difference is. I just expect a difference to exist. And what you're looking at there is a normal distribution. And essentially what you do is you collect your data and you look at the distribution of data you have, and you try to figure out how far outside that distribution are your data. And that leads us to generate a p-value where we either accept or reject our hypotheses. So this is the traditional way that science has been doing statistics. But as you can see from some of the references at the bottom of the slide, this is not without some controversy. So recently, there have been a lot of people talking about issues with p-values, issues with them not really being as good an indicator of kind of practical significance. So maybe I run my statistical test and maybe my p-value shows me that, oh, there's a difference there, but then, it's just an artifact of the data that I've collected or the manipulations I've done to my data. So the fields are moving toward a more Bayesian approach. So what's different about the Bayesian approach is that you have an informed prior. Essentially what this means is you don't go in pretending, well, I don't know anything about what could be happening. You start with some understanding of, here's what I think is going on. Here's my informed prior. Here's what I think a informed alternate hypothesis would look like. And then you still collect your data and you still compare your data to that previous hypothesis. But instead of just getting this number out, this 0.05, this accept and reject, what you get out is called a Bayes factor. And the Bayes factor essentially just tells you the likelihood that the data you've collected would exist given what you know about your informed priors, given what you said you thought it was going to look like. So this is a little bit more sophisticated way of thinking about your statistical analysis. It's not very common yet, but I see a lot of fields moving in this direction. So I wanted to make sure to mention it today, because if you have any opportunities to take training in these more Bayesian methods, I think you're going to find that this is the direction fields are going to be moving in going forward. So both things are going to continue to exist for a while, but I really expect in the next 20 years to have most people moved over to this more Bayesian approach to doing statistical analysis. Okay. So you've decided how you're going to analyze your data, but before you just jump right into doing your statistical tests, mostly what fields are going to expect you to do is tell us something about what your raw data look like. And so these we refer to as descriptive statistics. And the idea here is that a lot of the statistical tests you're doing have some sort of assumption about what the data look like. And so you need to provide information like your average, your median, your standard deviation, things like that. And there's a reference down there for an article I really like called How to Display Data Badly. And what you want to think about is what is the best way to communicate to your audience what your data look like. So what you're looking at here is a series of 3 plots. On the left-hand side, it's showing you a scatter plot, which is essentially your raw data. So each one of those dots represents a data point. And the solid lines there are showing you the 75th percentile, the 50th percentile, which we call the median, and the 25th percentile. When we turn all of those, so those 7 different types of data, if I turn those into a box plot, which you're seeing in the center, you'll notice that no matter what those individual data points look like, the box plots look identical. So what this diagram is trying to show you is that certain types of displays might hide important features of your data. So a box plot might not be the best way because it doesn't really show you what the true distribution is. It doesn't show you where the data are bunching up. And so the plot on the far right, those are called violin plots. And you can see that the violin plot kind of mimics the shape of the distribution. So the violin plots are, again, a newer way that people are displaying some of their data to better show what the underlying distribution is of it. So things to keep in mind. What are the norms in your field? How do people typically display data? And what are shortcomings people have identified with bad ways to display data? So if you've shown us what your raw data look like, now you're ready to move on to your statistical tests, which we refer to as inferential statistics. And again, these always need to tie back to your research question. So what are you trying to do? You should be aware of your independent and your dependent variables. So your independent variables are essentially the things that you might be manipulating, the things that you think might be affecting your outcome. And then the dependent variable is the outcome that you're interested in. So test scores, student attitudes, things like that. The way you phrase your research question is going to dictate what sort of statistical test you choose. So if you have framed your research question that you're doing some sort of comparison between groups, or you expect group A to be better than group B, you're looking at statistical tests that are for comparisons. So these would be things like t-tests, ANOVAs, and all of the various variations of ANOVAs. And I don't have time today to get into all of the specifics of why you would choose an ANOVA versus an ANCOVA, but there are a lot of resources and fields to help you kind of understand the best way to pick a statistical test. There's a resource I really like on the bottom there called The Reviewer's Guide to Quantitative Methods in the Social Sciences. And what I really like about that book is it very specifically tells you, if you're going to do a t-test, you need to demonstrate A, B, and C, and you need to show that your data look like this. So it's a very easy way to figure out if a statistical test is appropriate for you. What if your research question just talked about looking at relations between things or trying to do a prediction? In that case, you would use something more like a correlation or a regression. So again, the way that you framed your research question is going to help you understand what is the right statistical method to use after the fact. Now, a secret that I will let you in on is that actually all of the comparison tests are versions of the regression test, but generally they're taught as kind of independent types of tests. And so that's generally how you'll see them framed, is that they're different types of tests. And so what this all comes back to is that no matter what you're doing, you have to describe how your data meet the assumptions. You can't just pick a test and do it. You have to say, okay, I've chosen to use a MANOVA, a multivariate analysis of variance. In order to do this test, I have to show you that my data are normally distributed, that they have these relationships. And so you're going to have to walk your reader through all of the reasons why the test you've chosen is appropriate for your data and that it's going to answer your research question. So going back to other ways to think about like the big research designs, we talked about the methods, right? We talked about quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, but you might also want to think about what is the ultimate goal for your research? Are you trying to do something completely new? Are you trying to do novel science? Are you really trying to push your field ahead into a new area? And so this would be something like, no one has ever done this before. I am the first person to use this compound or to synthesize this thing. And if your results provide new insight or a really large advancement in your field, that can make publication easier, but it's kind of risky, right? It generally doesn't happen that the first time you go into your lab, you're going to synthesize the brand new thing without any issues, right? So you might find that it takes multiple attempts, multiple years to get to these novel findings. And you want to think about what are the norms in your field? Is your field going to let you publish the in-between steps? And I will make the argument that those in-between steps are very important. People should know what steps didn't work, just as much as they know the steps that did work, but you need to know what the norms are for your field or where are appropriate places to communicate the things that didn't work along the way. The other thing you can be trying to do is you're not trying to do a huge jump forward. You are working in a more confirmatory, a more incremental framework. So you're saying, oh, I see that somebody, did this experiment with this population, maybe they did it with high school students. I really want to do it with college students, and I want to see if the result is the same. The issue here is that some fields don't value that work as much, and that can make your publication difficult. But again, I would argue that this is really the foundation of science, is we need a lot of these little experiments. We need this kind of mass of underlying data to get the advances, to get people moving forward, to make those generalizable theories. So you really want to think about what level of risk you can tolerate, what is valued by your university, your field, that sort of thing. And I think there are pros and cons to both approaches. But again, for this research to be impactful, no matter which one you choose, you have to have a strong research design and clear alignment between your hypotheses, your methods, your analysis, and your results. Because it's all well and good to have a very splashy study where you're the first person to discover this new thing, but if no one trusts your methods and no one can see the data that you've collected and no one really thinks that your results are real, that doesn't help science at all. So no matter which direction you're choosing, you need to make sure that you're kind of demonstrating all that information we've already talked about, right? Going through the research design, going through the quality of your data, and going through your analysis plan. So with that, we'll switch gears a little bit into, well, how do you communicate that everything that you've done has been done well so that people can really learn from it and build from it? And again, this is a key underlying component of science, is that if you don't communicate it, you really haven't finished the circle, right? If someone else can't build on your work, you really haven't contributed to the scientific community. And so here I'm going to advocate for transparency. The more transparent you can be by providing as much information as possible about the methods you've done, the data you've collected, your analysis steps, even things that didn't work, that will improve the credibility of your results. People are more likely to trust your results and trust your research if they don't think you're hiding anything, if they can truly see all of the decisions you've made along the way. The really nice thing is that as journals are moving toward more online supplemental information, it becomes much easier for you to provide these details. So, back in the day where we had very strict word limits, sometimes you had to be very brief. Sometimes you couldn't talk about all of the different things that you've done in your research to get to the final conclusion. But I'm seeing a lot more papers where the online supplemental information is just as long as the paper, if not longer, because there truly are a lot of important details there that need to be communicated. Again, I'm going to encourage you to check reporting standards in your field or with specific journals. There's a really nice list that's been compiled by the National Institutes of Health in their National Library of Medicine, where they go through for almost every field, ranging from psychology and education, through chemistry, biology, physics, clinical science, and they talk about, well, what are the standards in your field? What are the ways that they expect to see different research results reported? How do they structure their manuscripts? That sort of thing. The other thing you want to keep in mind is what kind of journals are you trying to publish in? Because different journals have different reporting standards in terms of the amount of information they expect you to provide. So here I'm showing you just a snippet from the Nature family of journals website, where they talk about authors have to make your materials, your data, your code, and your protocols available. So this means, again, a lot of transparency. You have to be prepared to share all of that information if you want to publish in these journals. And the case I'm going to make for you today is that it's a lot easier if you start your research with sharing in mind. It's going to be a lot of work if at the very end, you're scrambling to package all of this in a way that can be shared with other people. But if you're always planning that everything you do is going to be shared, you're making good notes, you're documenting your records along the way, that really makes this process a lot smoother when you get to the end. So why should we do this? Why are journals asking people to share? Well, there have been recent news stories going on about a decade now talking about a crisis in science, that people aren't trusting results from science because there's not enough transparency, there's not enough understanding of what's going on. And certainly there are also some bad actors maybe doing bad science or misrepresenting their results. And so we've seen this in science in general, we've seen this in physical sciences, life sciences, and we've also seen this in psychology. So this is not unique to one field. This is all across the spectrum, is there have been concerns that the way that research is currently conducted and currently talked about, there's just not enough information for us to understand what's going on. And that has led to a crisis where people try to replicate or reproduce results and they're not able to. And that makes people feel a lot less confident in all of the science, even though all of the science might not have this problem. And so before we talk a little bit more about this, I want to get some definitions out of the way. So these definitions come from a National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report. And I want to use their terminology, even though not every field has kind of standardized this. So reproducibility, or computational reproducibility, is this idea that I could get the same results using the same data, same methods, same analysis steps. In order for this to happen, the original researcher has to provide their data, right? So that I can analyze it. They have to tell me the methods that they use so that I can follow the same steps. And this is made a lot easier if they are using statistical software that works with an analysis code. So if there's some sort of written record of the analysis steps that they've done, if they can share the code as well. So this is reproducibility. So reproducibility is same results from the same data. In contrast, we have replicability, or replication. Replication is just the ability to obtain consistent results. So yes, we saw a difference. Yes, this group was better than the other group, but from new data. So new data are collected, but using the same methods and undergoing the same analysis steps. In order for this to happen, the researchers have to provide their instruments, right? So if it's a survey, I need to know, well, what questions did you ask students to measure that variable? If it's more of a lab bench instrument, maybe I need to know what model you used. I need to know what settings you had it on. So I need to have information about how you collected your data. I need to know how you analyzed your data. I have to have your detailed procedures so that when I go collect new data, I can make sure that I'm following your methods. So these are the two big ideas: is reproducibility, no new data; replication, new data, but you're still trying to show essentially the same trend. So I want to show you the results of kind of a big study you may have heard about in psychology. So this is a series of replication studies in psychology. And so what you're looking at here on the x-axis are the original studies, the original effect sizes. And so the colors here, the blue means it was statistically significant using that hypothesis testing we talked about earlier. And so you can see that almost everything in that top data distribution is blue. Almost everything was statistically significant in the original studies, and the effect sizes were around 0.25. So those are the original studies across the x-axis. On the y-axis are replication studies. So these are replication studies that used material from the original authors. The study design was reviewed in advance, so people signed off on that study design, and they had enough sample size to detect these group differences. But what you're seeing on the y-axis in the replication studies is you're seeing a lot more pink. You're seeing a lot more not statistically significant results, and you're seeing that the effect size there, so the height of that curve, is actually right around 0, which makes sense because they weren't statistically significant. So what the authors are trying to tell you there is, if they were able to replicate all of the studies, you would expect all of the dots to fall along that diagonal line. You would say that the original effect size is matching the replication effect size. You know, everything is working as intended. I am able to replicate those results. And instead, what they're finding is that most of their replications had weaker evidence. So their replications generally were not working as well as the original studies. Again, even though they did as much as they could to make sure they were using identical materials, identical procedures, they were just collecting new data. And so this is where this crisis comes from, right? Even if I have these original materials, I'm not able to get the same results, there must be something else going on. There must be more information we need to share. There must be something else we need to understand in order to figure out why this is happening. This is not unique to psychology, okay? So this is a survey sent out by Nature to some of its readers, talking about what factors contribute to irreproducible, so the inability to reproduce someone else's research. So they're using the term reproduce, but really they mean replicate, collect new data. And so what a lot of scientists are saying is that 70% of them have tried to redo someone else's experiment and they have failed. And over half have tried to redo their own experiments and they failed. And I think that's okay, right? It's very possible that, the conditions were slightly different. I can't generate the same results, but why are those things getting into, published results? Should there be a standard where we're going to ask people to make sure, like, do it 5 times and tell me the results of those 5 trials? And what I do want to show you on this plot in terms of the reasons why people are saying it's not working, fraud is very low on the list. So in general, this is not malicious. The idea here is that, no one is actively, or most people aren't actively going in trying to do bad science or trying to communicate bad data. They maybe just really aren't providing as much detail as people need to be able to reproduce the results. Maybe they're not telling you the temperature that they did things at, or they're not being very clear about the, how they standardize their solutions and things like that. So this is not so much solving the problem as just identifying that a problem exists, right? That scientists are aware that this is an issue and that a lot of things get into the published literature that they really can't replicate on their own. And funding agencies are aware of this. And so that's what I want to spend kind of the last part of today talking about with you is, what are funding agencies doing? What are the steps forward to address this? So many funding agencies are now endorsing standards for this transparency and reporting. And so they'll refer to that in terms of open science, reproducibility, replicability, things like that. So the first report I told you about was the one from the National Academies in terms of reproducibility and replicability in science. There's also a UNESCO report on recommendations for conducting open science. I've seen similar things from our National Science Foundation and the Institutes of Education Sciences. And then there's also a big push through the European Research Council as part of their Horizon 2020 grants. So this is a huge thing. This is where the funding agencies are going. And I think now is the time to integrate these practices into how you do science, because they are going to become the norm moving forward. So let's talk about some of the practices they're encouraging people to adopt. So the first one is this idea of pre-registration. So the idea of pre-registration is this idea, like we just talked about, there's all of these things you need to do to plan your study in advance. And what you can do is you can put all of those plans on file. You can pre-register your detailed research plan, your detailed analysis plan prior to starting any of your data collection. And the reasons that you would do this is because this provides accountability. If I said I was going to do 3 experiments and then I got to my final paper and I only reported the results of 1, someone can go back and look and say, well, you said you were doing these 3 things, where are the other results? So this can guard against publication bias in terms of only reporting things that worked, prevents you from only showing your statistically significant results. And so this plot here, it comes from a science article just talking about how much this is exploding in fields moving forward. So the bars there are showing you journals offering registered reports. And what registered reports are is you register that with a specific journal. So the black line is something called pre-registrations on the Open Science Framework, which I'll tell you about in a minute here. The Open Science Framework, anyone can post their pre-registration on. The registering with a specific journal means that you intend to submit your final paper to that journal, and it actually gets peer reviewed. So your pre-plan gets reviewed by people associated with the journal. They kind of give you the go-ahead to do your data collection, then you go ahead and do your science, and then you're going to report the results back to the same journal. So it's kind of opposite how peer review normally works, right? We normally think about, well, you only talk to the journal after everything's done, after you write it up, but this is kind of opposite, that you talk to the journal when you have your plans in advance, you essentially get your plans signed off on. So that's pre-registration. Also sharing your code, right? So we talked about this idea that if I want to do this replication or I want to reproduce someone's research, I need to have their data, I need to have their code. So there's a lot of repositories for being able to put this on. It also encourages people to use software that's accessible to all. So I have transitioned my entire research group to using the statistical software R because it's free. So nobody has to buy an expensive statistical package to reproduce my results. And I also post my data and my analysis on websites like GitHub so that when I publish a journal article, someone can go here and they can get the same results that I got because they can download my code and they can run my code on their own computer. So this is one of the things that journals are encouraging people to do: share their data, share their analysis steps. You're also seeing a lot more emphasis on data management plans, which is, again, funding agencies making you have plans for not only how you're going to store your data, but how you're going to make that data accessible. And I'm not seeing as much of this in the United States, but the European Research Council has some very specific guidelines for people who have received funding from them. And they refer to these as the FAIR guidelines. And this is the idea that your research has to be, your data have to be findable, they have to be accessible, they have to be interoperable which means that you need to save it in a format that other people can open. So not something proprietary where you have to have a fancy software, just something like a text file or a CSV file. And you have to make sure that, these are available because they really want people to reuse the data. If you think from the point of view of a funding agency, a lot of times what they're spending a lot of money on is the collection of the data, right? Recruiting your participants or purchasing the samples or getting the equipment to do it. And if we're able to make the data shareable so that someone else can analyze it or combine it with other data without the expense of collecting new data, that really benefits the funders. And that's why they're really pushing this idea of getting your data out in the open. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of preprints. So unlike everything else we've talked about, which kind of comes in at the planning stage, preprints happen at the end. So preprints are when you provide a public copy of your manuscript to a public database, generally at the same time that you submit it for publication and review in a journal. The benefits of this is that your work gets into the public sphere a lot faster than it would through a journal, because the revise, resubmit process can take months. This way you can get your manuscript out there right away. Now, generally these websites are designed so that other scientists can read and comment, so you still get a version of peer review. And the other benefit is that this takes research out from behind a paywall, because even after your manuscript gets accepted, it might be to a journal that not everyone has access to, but by putting it in a preprint server that's free, more people are able to see it. Be aware that different fields have different norms for this. So most journals are accepting of preprints. They do not consider preprints prior publication. It would not exclude you from being able to publish with a journal, but you do want to check specific guidelines for whatever journal you're working with. Different fields also have different places for preprints. So archive.org is kind of the original place for preprints, but you can see that biology has their own, chemistry has their own, health research has their own. So look at what the norms are around your field. And again, just another graph showing kind of the explosion in these methods. So the idea that who is embracing preprints, but it's not necessarily the same everywhere. So this is just within biology, but you can see that different subfields have embraced preprints at different rates, right? So neuroscience, a lot of preprints, cancer biology, not so much. And so again, this is where seeing what the norms in your field are, seeing what other researchers do, will help you make a judgment about if this is the right thing to do with your work. So I'll leave you with a discussion of 2 resources that might be helpful as you're thinking about how to communicate your science in an open and reproducible way. So the first one is the Open Science Framework that I mentioned earlier. This is really one of the top things. You'll see a lot of people discussing it. It's a kind of a one-stop shop. So they will help you design your study, pre-register it, so list all the information about exactly what you're going to do. They give you a place to store your data, and then you're able to link your published research back to it. And that all happens inside one single website. And they give you links to all of those things that you can share. So like DOIs, these digital object identifiers, a permanent link to show someone, yes, I registered this research plan 2 years ago. You can go read that registered research plan to see how it compares to the research I'm writing about in my publication now. Something similar for the EU is this Open Air website. Again, they don't so much host the things, but they provide a one-stop shop to help you find all of the resources you need to do this. So in conclusion, the idea here is that conducting scientific research is complex, right? There's a lot of planning, a lot of decisions that go into it, but the more careful you are with your planning at the beginning, the more likely you are to succeed. And I want to be clear that succeed doesn't mean, oh, I found this new thing or I proved my hypothesis correct, but collecting data and sharing it is successful science, as long as it's shared well and the research is done well. So there is value in communicating your failed experiments, as long as you are using rigorous methods and you're communicating that in an open way that other people can build off of. The idea here is that increased transparency benefits everyone, and it is the new normal. This is how things are going to be happening moving forward. And I think it's better to start to train yourself to use these methods now so that you can keep up with where the field is going to be moving forward. I think this also makes you more attractive to funding agencies and to journals, showing that you're embracing this more modern way to do science. Again, the funders like it because it gets them new data, or it gets them data out there without spending money on it. And there's actually been recent research showing that this type of more collaborative, more open approach to science actually benefits people who are traditionally underrepresented. So if we think about the idea of, the old version of science as a single scientist alone in his office just doing his work, we know that's not the norm. We know that there are huge teams of people sharing expertise and working together, and being more clear about this sharing aspect, this communal aspect of science is really encouraging female scientists to participate in ways that they hadn't been in the past. So with that, I want to thank you for your time and attention today. And I've seen a couple questions pop up in the chat, so I can either answer them now or at the end, whatever's easier.
Thanks very much, Regis. I think we'll do it at the end. Nodar will run a discuss, if it's okay with you, if your schedule allows, Nodar will run a question discussion period at the very end. Thanks very much. That was great. Yeah, I have some things I'd like to discuss with you later offline.
Dr. Rochelle, maybe
Yeah.
it's better to ask the questions now, because maybe Regis has another commitments later and cannot attend at the end of the meeting. So I would prefer, with your permission, to ask the questions now. Is it okay?
It's okay with me, Regis. What do you prefer?
Yeah, I can do one or two now. I can also stay. So if people need a break before the next one, I'm also okay with that. And I can stay around for the questions at the end.
Okay, in this case, let's do another presentation and later on ask all the questions.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks again, Regis. Our next speaker will be Brianna Quintero. Thanks very much for participating and for your presentation. And communication is obviously, as Dr. Caperna has said, a critical part of research. If you don't communicate the results, it really may have little impact. So with that, Brianna, I'll turn it over to you. And do you have screen sharing?
Yes, let me go ahead and just pull up my presentation. Okay. Let's see, here we are. Okay. Excellent. I think we are set for presenting. Let me just pull up my notes, please. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Chow, for the introduction. And I agree with you. And thank you so much to our previous speaker for highlighting the importance of communication in all fields, as what is it worth if we're not sharing it with the people who need it the most, which are other researchers or the general public. So I'm very happy and passionate about communication, and I'm going to share a few different aspects of it that I thought might be interesting to the variety of audience members. Let me go ahead and share. So I'll be giving a brief introduction to myself and the SDSU Georgia project and the role that communication has played in shaping our students as scientists and professionals. I'll briefly discuss communication theory and practice just so we understand where we're coming from, especially in European context. Communication, people often think I'm in telecommunications or a different field. So I just want to clarify what that means and how we define and study that at San Diego State University. I'll be discussing the benefits of communication in the curriculum of higher education for academic and professional and personal development. And finally, I will also discuss some of the differences between communication and the role it plays in my observation and my time in US and Georgian university contexts, especially as we are currently working to explore the possibility of a joint degree program. So this is something that we've been really exploring, how we can infuse some aspects of communication into this. And finally, I'm going to give some public speaking and presentation skill advice. As this is a mini course, I'm going to be giving a mini course in public speaking and how you can help strengthen your own presentation skills. So briefly, I was a lecturer at the School of Communication in San Diego. I was also a speech and debate coach. So if we're talking about theory and practice, I came more from the practice end of professional public speaking coaching. I joined SDSU Georgia in 2016. So I came to train communication lecturers here and have successfully trained 3 full-time professors in this area. And also, as we expanded our needs, I also serve as a communication and career development advisor. And this is something I'm really going to focus on in the difference between higher education preparation for academic and workforce skills. This is where communication really builds that bridge between, again, theory and practice, between obtaining knowledge and applying it in the industry and in higher education. Additionally, I am also a certified yoga and meditation instructor, which builds into the idea of communication as a skill that is directly related to, let's say, a stress response, which I'll be discussing later when I talk about communication as a skill development. But first, a brief overview. Again, when I'm speaking of communication as a field of study, as we define it at San Diego State University and in most US university contexts, we're discussing less about, again, communication systems in a technical sense. And we're really discussing how the study of how people use messages to generate meaning. And as we can see here in this communication model, there are several processes involved in both the interpretation of messages, in the creation of messages, and the sending and receiving of messages. And the field of communication has a really multidisciplinary foundation rooted in psychology, sociology, using anthropology, and a variety of research methodologies. So this introduction of communication serves many purposes because it introduces students to various research methodologies. As we just discussed, there's benefits to using multidisciplinary approaches. And some students, especially in Georgian university contexts, are receiving one type of training and sometimes are only exposed to one methodology in the undergraduate experience. So introducing a multidisciplinary field is directly exposing academics to multidisciplinary approaches and different viewpoints. So this is a really interesting field, I think, to expand our horizons in both your own use of multidisciplinary approaches as well as future collaborations. The field of communication utilizes humanistic, social scientific, as well as aesthetic inquiry. So I think it is a very, not to overuse the word, multidisciplinary field that can expose and spark some interest in different use of methodologies and collaboration. Communication is also multidisciplinary in the sense that it combines theory and practice in both the study as well as the courses used. So students, when they're studying communication, are not only exposed to communication models, which help them understand their own everyday processes, they also may be exposed to the idea of media studies, which can encourage critical thinking and critical consumption of media, which we know is very important for all students as a foundation and all people as a foundation. Intercultural communication patterns, again, different research methodologies, as well as the practice of public speaking, active listening, argumentation and debate, and persuasion. So depending on the course or the lessons learned, students may enrich themselves with theoretical constructs, with different foundations, as well as be able to practice communication skills. So first, I'll cover some of the benefits to academic development before I move toward the professional and personal development in the field of communication, or rather with the introduction of communication. So one of the core courses that are required through actually the CSU system, California State University system, is Communication 103, Oral Communication, which introduces, that's a new word, which introduces the foundations of communication theory, right, in order for self-understanding, speech, writing, and public speaking, and verbal and written presentation skills. And these are part of the core competencies that are infused in the general education curriculum. So every student must take this course because it is recognized that students from every field, including our STEM students, right, our program notes the importance of, again, sharing your innovations, sharing your research in order to continue to build off of it and learn from it. And that's why this course is one of the core required courses that teaches these skills. One of the other benefits to having this course as a core course is that we do focus on the assessment of sources for credibility. This is one of the first courses that students take. And if they did not learn how to do it before, we cover what makes a credible source and not a credible source. We cover some of what we would think would be fundamental basics, but practice separating opinions from facts. And as we know, this is only going to strengthen the foundation for academic rigor and academic study. And the use of verbal and written citations, right? We're used to some of the academic writing, but when you're doing conference presentations, when you're doing even just classroom presentations, understanding how to properly use verbal citations and statistics to enhance your presentations is an important area. Of course, learning APA style. And again, as I mentioned before, different scientific approaches and different research methodologies. In some of the courses, the students are encouraged to utilize a different research methodology than they previously do in their own major. So again, this enhances a wider breadth of knowledge and can encourage them to think about the benefits of multidisciplinary research and cross collaboration. And of course, presentation skills. Speech writing and organizational skills we recognize as something that all people from all majors will have to utilize, especially those who are engaging in academic conferences and presentations, as well as communicating with a lay audience. The understanding of different speaking scenarios, so introductory speeches, informative speeches, right? Persuasive speeches and impromptu speeches. And again, understanding the difference between those helps enhance their understanding of how to create a competent speech and a coherent speech in order to communicate their findings and observations. These sorts of presentation skills, right? How to make a good PowerPoint. You might even have come across some academics who, you know, in their graduate studies are still struggling with this skill. And if we can teach that as a core course, then we really are doing our students a favor, right, for their future presentation skills, as well as nonverbal presentation skills. Go ahead. And finally, audience analysis and persuasion are another key component. Understanding how to pivot your speech to a lay audience and moving from perhaps an academic conference with people solely in your field and presenting at a more multidisciplinary field or presentation is also something that is very interesting. Utilizing argumentation and skills, right? How to lay out a clear argument. That is the foundation of a research paper, right? You must lay out a clear argument and make sure that you're practicing good logic. And again, a lot of this will be beneficial as you continue on with your studies, utilizing ethos, pathos, and logos, and also how to appeal to an audience is something that we see as necessary. Our students, just with the SDSU tradition, our engineer students have to do capstone presentations where they present their research to a lay audience, to their community. And again, this is very beneficial in order to share their innovations with the people who may need it most, which are the people they're designing for, right, as engineers. And after we look at some of the benefits from, let's say, an academic foundation, we can additionally point toward professional and personal development. When we discuss professional development, obviously the ability to give presentations is an invaluable skill for any industry or major. The practice of conducting live Q&A sessions is also something that is extremely beneficial and something that students have found valuable, especially those who have gone forward and moved to disciplines where they have to interact with people more, especially when they have startups, they're seeking funding, they're having to communicate with different stakeholders that are outside of their technical competence. So this has been very beneficial. They're able to practice professional development skills such as active listening and learning how to give and receive feedback, which is something that they do practice in this course. And this is something, again, that people well in their professional careers may still be struggling with. And if we can share these skills now, then we are only doing a service to our students and our future professionals. And this allows them to collaborate and lead effectively. Regarding personal development, understanding communication processes can help us make sense of our everyday interactions, right? Just from a personal development level, the way we interact with family members, with friends, with strangers, the ways we deal with stress and anxiety, as well as critical thinking skills when we are studying a variety of topics, including media analysis. And this understanding of communication theories can actually lead to, again, interesting cross collaborations or more human-centered or empathetic design. And I'll show you a couple examples of this from our own students. But the benefits of multidisciplinary approach can lead them to understand the importance of collaborating with other people from different fields, such as anthropologists or communication scholars, in order to design for people, right? So again, in order to effectively reach their designated audience and understand their needs, there requires some level of empathy and understanding. And this is something that is very beneficial. I'll go ahead and share an example from my interpersonal communication course, where we understand communication theories and such things as nonverbal communication cues. Our students have infused it with their own major, where they designed, this is a ASL interpreter robot, but they used communication theories in order to ensure that they were meeting the needs and that they were understanding how communication can be assessed from a social scientific perspective. We've also, this is a picture from researchers at Carnegie Mellon who have used machine learning in order to read body language and symbols. And this is something that one of our students became interested and involved with once they learned the importance of nonverbal communication and the theories that underlie it in order to better create machine learning processes that could understand human interaction. So we can see that by exposing students to this variety of majors, we're encouraging cross-collaboration and encouraging a deeper understanding of the people that we're designing for, right? The innovations that we're trying to help from a more, we can say, human-centered and empathetic perspective. And finally, the other benefit of personal development when studying communication, specifically when studying public speaking and live interactions, is the idea of self-awareness. Communication and public speaking in general is many times used as a, we can say, non-threatening form of stress response for many studies, right? When we're trying to study stress, a lot of times they'll have people either do very fast math or give a presentation, because we understand that the public speaking often elicits a physiological response of stress, and learning how to deal with that, again, can help us grow as individuals, which is something that we should all come out of when any kind of educational experience or training. students from these courses are also given constructive criticism. I provide a full sheet saying these are the ways that you should improve, or you may improve. And the ability to take that kind of constructive criticism, we can all agree is an invaluable skill, and understanding how you can incrementally improve in any way. This is something that, once you submit articles for publication, you're going to be faced with criticism. You're going to be faced with ways to improve, and this helps build resilience from we can say the first year of university, and understanding that constructive criticism can only make us better. And finally, the ability to understand the importance of the other continues to build empathy in whether it's a scientist for the innovations that we're creating, or any kind of collaboration. We're understanding how to give and receive feedback and how to be more empathetic individuals. Some of the communication courses that we do provide at San Diego State University, Georgia, and next I'll talk about those impacts and some of those differences I do see between the universities. We also teach intercultural communication, which again helps individuals not only learn about different research methodologies. Students are actually asked to use ethnographic research and qualitative research. These are computer engineers and computer scientists who are then being asked to go outside and go into the field and understand how anthropologists see the world. And again, I point to this example of my student who said, hey, I want to use machine learning to make ethnography better. And this is the kind of cross collaboration that we can see. And it's very important to be exposed to that. So I sound like I'm doing a sales pitch, speaking of persuasion for communication, but I think we can see the benefit of this for all students of all and people of all disciplines, right? Especially following this very important talk about different research methodologies and the importance of the ability to use multidisciplinary approaches. We also utilize organizational and business communication, which again is more of a job-ready presentation skill, interview skill crash course. And this is not an isolated case. We're seeing this in other universities. There's actually hybrid courses such as communication for engineers or communication for civil and construction engineers that teach them how to communicate once they do get on the job site, and emphasize some of the skills that are most important for them. We can also see this in 4+1 programs where students may be embarking on 4 years of computer science and 1 year of innovation and entrepreneurship. The reality is that we live in a multidisciplinary world. And again, we are only doing a service to ourselves and other students to encourage them to expand their horizons academically, professionally, and personally. This is also offered through various communication certificates. And this is, again, currently being explored and seeing how we can infuse this in the Georgian university system. Let me go ahead and move past these, and I'll skip to the idea of communication skills in US and Georgian university context before I move back to some kind of takeaways that we can use. So as I mentioned previously, one of the other hats that I'm wearing is helping explore the possibility of US, specifically SDSU Georgia, SDSU education in Georgia, which utilizes communication as a core requirement. Both students, employers have noticed the benefit of our students utilizing communication as a core requirement that they must fill. And so this is something that we're exploring for other Georgian university programs within our partnerships. This is a part of the general education curriculum. And if we want to talk about the differences between the US and Georgian university curriculums, one of the biggest changes, and it's not just Georgian universities, if we understand the European university curriculum, it tends to be more major specific, whereas the US university curriculum most of the first 2 years are really diving into general education components. This includes things such as critical thinking skills, which may include philosophy, writing skills, academic, as well as communication skills, understandings of politics. Now, some of these, after my own observation of the Georgia University requirements, some of these are outlined, but the US university programs require so much more core competencies in the fields of general education. And some of these areas really, I would say, really provide the bridge between your university diploma and your potential for either continuing education or jumping into industry. And this is one of the biggest differences that I've noticed. And this is one of the biggest reasons why we actually started the Career Development Center at SDSU Georgia, because we found that this was the missing link, and that most of what the US universities and what many of my students at San Diego State asked was, I want to know skills that will help me get employed. I want skills that will help me when I continue on my graduation. And this extra boost many times came in the form of communication. And we can see this also in the capstone projects, right? Where students not only have to collaborate with industry experts, but they also have to present their findings and communicate them in a way that is easily digestible to the public. And this ability, this skill to share the innovations is something that makes them valuable to employers and even valuable within their own field. Again, because they're able to collaborate and communicate to other people from other fields. And that's where this theory versus practice skill comes in. Another benefit that we've seen through SDSU Georgia is that including these communication courses actually has greatly increased language development and proficiency if we're talking about an English language program, which is something we're trying to establish. As we know, when you're learning a new language, many students come in understanding how to read and write, but presenting a scientific project, that's a whole new level of fluency. And this type of training helps prepare them for presentation skills at professional conferences, right? You don't want that to be the first time that you're presenting a research project or innovation. So this creates kind of a training program for those skills. And again, this is not just at the undergraduate level. We've also held workshops for PhD and master's students on how to present your findings. And for some of them, this is the first time they've received this type of training. Again, imagine the benefits of having that as a foundation course in your first year of university. It prepares you to be more willing, interested, and able to communicate your findings to a broader audience, which we know is very beneficial. We found that it also prepares students for employment context where their public speaking is expected. And that's where some of our students have shined. And additionally, it prepares students with some of the skills that are expected, let's say in US university context, which is the ability to communicate openly, individually, and in a professional context. So studying abroad in a different semester, it would help minimize that culture shock and some of that, the communication skills that are more infused, let's say, in the US university and US education systems, right? Even in the K through 12 context, public speaking and presentation skills are encouraged. And this course allows our students, some of who travel abroad to the US, to not fall behind. So this is also a very important skill for, let's say, continuing your education or diving into another context where you're having to perhaps catch up with some of those communication and presentation skills. So we do feel that it serves an invaluable role in the space of education. All right. And we can see here, for an example, these are two of our Georgian University students, SDSU Georgia University students who are presenting their capstone projects. They also traveled to the US and were able to, again, minimize some of that culture shock of having to present their findings and present their research at the Student Research Symposium. They were able to thrive successfully because they had that practice here. And you know, this again is only beneficial for their academic and professional endeavors. Lastly, for this area, again, this is one of the missing links that we found between the US and Georgian university context, which is that real life bridge of how they can develop those skills before they even graduate. So they exit their university experience feeling prepared for success. And part of that is, of course, having career and graduate school advising, having interview and networking opportunities. Again, this is outside of required courses. This is these are services they're able to access. And this is some of the things that we found help students succeed in not only higher education, but industry, right? The ability to have some of these core professional development training is a really essential part of having them come out feeling prepared and ready for university continuation or industry experience. So this is, I just want to highlight, this is one of the areas that we found that greatly give our students an advantage in both industry and academic contexts. And this is something that we hope to pass on as a tradition in these university contexts in order to have the most well-rounded preparation they can. Okay. All right, let me just go ahead and move back to some of those public speaking and presentation skills. In case some of you are wondering, this sales pitch sounds so nice for communication. How can I communicate better? And I'll give you a mini course right now, just a few things that we can do to understand communication from this theory and practice perspective in order to enhance our own skills. And then I'll end with a little presentation of what we've been doing here at San Diego State University, Georgia. So as I mentioned before, after receiving my education, I went on to study yoga and meditation. I say, what does that have to do with public speaking and communication? But if we understand communication, again, as a stress response, again, commonly a stressor for stress-based research, right? It is that the physiological reactions to public speaking, again, we explain, and I explain to my students and my clients that it is a natural part of your body. And it's not if you have these reactions, it's what are your reactions, because each of us responds differently. So understanding your own physiological response is the first part of understanding how your body reacts to stressful situations, potentially stressful situations. And those can differ for different people, whether it's the sweaty palms, whether it's the flushing of the cheeks from the blood moving upward, whether it's the shallow breath. All of these things mean that your body's functioning correctly, right? It's preparing you for some sort of stressful response. So observing these things is the first part to understanding how you can minimize. Again, we cannot remove stress. We can just mitigate those and prepare for those specific reactions. For example, my own physiological response is that my hands shake a bit when I do presentations. So I said, if your hands shake a bit, use thicker cardstock, right? You can't see a shaking hand if you're using a thicker cardstock, such as a cue card, but you can see it and hear it if we see a rattling paper. Other people's are shallow breath. So they might even write in their speech at the end of their sentence to take a deeper breath, because they're, again, autopilot, their automatic response is to have that shallow breathing, right? Whether you're having flushing cheeks, again, deep breaths are always going to help with those areas. And so you can prepare yourself with a podium, without. There's many different things you can do in order to mitigate those stress responses. But first, you have to understand and observe those. You can do that by recording yourself doing a presentation. You can ask for feedback from your friends and family, but usually with my own clients or students, we do a primary recording session just to see what we can observe as far as these stress responses. And some of these stress responses can be felt and not seen, so any kind of self-reflection is beneficial in that end. One of the reasons why yoga and meditation is an essential part of understanding this is understanding the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what helps us calm down from this stress response. And the number one way to mitigate this, again, is breath. There's different types of breathing that can help you. Generally, extending your exhale, the length of your exhale, can help mitigate some of these stress responses, as well as moving from what we call chest breathing to belly breathing. So when we're running from a threat or we're having that physiological response, the breathing is up in our chests. You can see our shoulders moving. And this is what can lead some people to hyperventilate. Believe it or not, in my class, I've had people run out, pass out, cry, all of these things because we are dealing with real stress responses. And so you have to learn how to face those fears. And this is where the personal and professional development really grows. Belly breathing is when you would put your hand on your stomach and take those deeper breaths from the stomach. And this is going to allow you to activate that parasympathetic nervous system and have a calmer breathing experience, which then helps mitigate a lot of these stress responses. So just understanding yourself and how you react to stress can help you in public speaking and beyond. Again, preparing yourself for those things, using the heavier cardstock, pre-planning your gestures, infusing breathing points into your speech. Those are all helpful things. So again, it's not understanding if you get stress responses, it's rather what are those and how can we minimize those until we are feeling comfortable. And then of course, rehearsing those presentations, rehearsing those ways that we can mitigate some of those stress responses, whether they're filler words or using breaths instead of those can help us understand how we can better prepare for a confident presentation. One of the other basics for my mini course would be the importance of using a roadmap or a speech structure. And this is one of the things that every person should know and every person should understand, that you can build a speech and minimize your nerves by understanding where you're going. I said having a speech without an outline is like driving without GPS. You might end up somewhere and you don't know where you're going, right? And this is the same thing for any kind of academic paper or writing. But when you're doing that presentation, understanding that roadmap can help us gain some sort of coherence for where we're going. Because if you don't know where you're going in the speech, your audience will not either, right? And it doesn't matter what you say if you're not understood. So between 2 to 4 main points is what our brain likes, right? Anything more than 4 points, our research has shown that our attention loses focus. These can be done in what we call a 3x1 model, where you have 3 main points with a few 1 or 2 supporting points, or a 2x2 model, where you break down your main points into 2 general areas with 2 supporting larger subpoints. Establishing your credibility is a good idea, as well as within the context of your speech, and giving a very clear reason to listen. This is one of the key components when you're presenting your research findings to a lay audience, right? When we're presenting at an academic conference, of course, communication scholars understand the importance of nonverbal tie signs in intercultural contexts, but why would a lay audience care? We need to tell them that specifically. So again, just like we design products for humans with empathy in mind, we should design our presentations and speeches with some sort of empathy or understanding of the other and what they care about and why they should listen. And if you're able to clarify that, you're able to at least catch their attention and let them understand why it's of importance. Coming from my speech and debate background, we have a speech called the impromptu speech, where they're given a topic and these students can present a 5-minute speech in 2 minutes. Whoa, how is that possible? They use a roadmap. And this is an example of a roadmap that an impromptu speaker might use, and something that you can use. If you're called upon to present your findings or research, all you need is a brief roadmap in order to enhance understanding, clarity, and confidence. And finally, there actually is a method to the madness with online presentations and face-to-face communication. There's differences in, obviously, the type of movement you can use, the type of eye contact that you can use, as well as the level of gestures that you can use. Obviously, there's a benefit with public speaking and face-to-face. We're able to engage audience members when they're losing track by moving toward the audience or changing direction, by engaging those speakers who are not listening by using eye contact. But in the online methodology, where do my eyes go? Your eyes go straight at the camera, as if you're mimicking a face-to-face eye contact, and then back to the icon when we're listening. So these kinds of tips and tricks and presentation skills are beneficial for multiple contexts. But again, as I mentioned, they serve not only for practice, such as presentation skills, but the idea of understanding the way we communicate also introduces a variety of scientific perspectives, social scientific perspectives, humanistic perspectives that can lead us to understand ourselves, others, and perhaps collaborate and become more multidisciplinary researchers in the future. And the last thing I want to share is just a little preview of what we've done at San Diego State University, Georgia. Again, the benefits of sharing some of the communication principles, both theory and practice, with our primarily, let's say, all STEM students in different fields. So I'll just share this short video, and then I'll be open to any questions.
I wish to watch my iris wristwatch. I wish to watch my iris wristwatch. I wish to watch my iris wristwatch. Humble peace, easy buzzing, humble peace. In the beginning, Pharaoh was scared and afraid of what the teachers or the other students are going to think, but they quickly realized that it's a comfortable environment for them. So we strive to teach students leadership and communication skills. We do this through interactive activities, book lectures, and also writing and presenting speeches. So they're able to apply that to any major or any aspect of their education. So the goal is to get them to be comfortable speaking in any type of environment. So whether it's academic research conferences, it's sales pitches for the future ventures, and general class presentations, to come out as competent leaders.
Very good. Don't forget the review. Today we presented most as a speaker. We talked about blank, 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 and the end. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We learned how to speak in front of many people, how to conduct ourselves, and be professional. I think this is really important in our field, as there's a lot of presentations. You need to be persuasive about your research and the products that you develop. Personally, I love engineering, so I think it's really important to be able to show people how to communicate with them.
Okay, so thank you so much for listening. This was a little wrap-up video of the public speaking showcase. Again, we encourage students to share their interest, innovation, and research. And again, we understand the benefits, again, academically, personally, professionally, and hope that you too can see the benefit of this. And I encourage you to contact me if you have any questions regarding communication, either from the theory or practice perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brianna. We'll hold questions till the end, as we said. I will just say that I happened to was able to have dinner with major donors to San Diego State that were also employers of our engineering students. And one of the things that they stressed as extremely valuable and desirable characteristics were communication skills, both formal and informal communication skills. So I found it interesting that they singled that out along with ability to act independently. They felt that knowledge was not as big of an issue as communication skills and independent ability to act within the company. So thank you very much, Brianna. We'll have questions at the end. Dean Guven joined us during the talks, was able to join us, and Magda from the Millennium Corporation, and maybe they would. Dr. Guven, would you like to say a few things?
Of course, thank you, Walt. I would like to thank everyone for joining this last mini course of the 2020-21 academic year. And I managed to join an hour late because I was on the executive committee meeting, another meeting that coincided this one. But I see that it is fully participated. So I want to thank both the presenters as well as the participants, and look forward to completing this mini session as well. Maybe I can pass on to Magda then.
Before you do you want to say something about the certificate program and how that will work?
Yeah, this is a series. The mini course is a series, and this is the 5th one. And completion of this series will earn a certificate on STEM research and capacity building in the Western sense. So this will be completed, and all the sessions are kept saved on a Google Drive. Anna Tonikiani will be able to tell you how you can watch the ones that you may have missed, or if those that could not participate today, they could be able to complete this mini course as well, so they can earn the certificate. So the certificates will be issued beginning of next academic year. In September, when we start the next academic year, we'll be honoring those that completed the certificates, and we'll present them their certificates, hopefully in person. So we're hoping that by September, per government plans.
Keep our fingers crossed.
Yes, I think it will happen. I think those is coming. So, but anyway, we can delay the certificate ceremony maybe for Walt to join us as well. So Walt, maybe in the fall you can travel, so we can plan the next academic year certificate program, as well as present the certificates to the ones that earn. But
great, that sounds excellent.
Yeah. So we, after this one, after this session, we'll send out, Anna Tonikiani will send out information about where you can find the recordings of this session as well as the others. And I guess there's a procedure in completing the ones that you have not watched, and maybe by August 31st, we can ask everybody to complete 2020-21 certificates. And in September, I will still hope that we'll have an in-person meeting, and we'll hope that Walt will join us as well for the certificate session. So I have confidence that it will happen, and I believe the vaccines are arriving mid-July, right? I mean, there's 1 million doses coming, and there is Pfizer coming from the United States. So I guess if we can spread news to everyone that they should get vaccinated, and
Yeah, I cannot stress that enough. It's made all the difference in the US to be vaccinated. It just takes the whole weight off your shoulders. So get vaccinated as soon as you can.
And we just finished executive committee meeting where we're going to use the main campus, STSU main campus vaccination record keeping and safekeeping of the data. So we'll ask students to upload their vaccination certificates to a protected, Google Drive or something. So I'm waiting news on that. So we're hoping that will happen, and I'll pass it back to you, Walt.
Okay, thanks very much, Hillel, and welcome. Thanks. Sorry you were late, but great. Thank you for joining us. Magda Magredzi is the CEO for the Millennium Foundation, has been a fantastic supporter of SDSU Georgia, and then our follow-on activities to continue to build STEM capability in Georgia and support it from San Diego State. Magda, thanks for all your help over the many years or centuries, however long it's been. But, millennial, yeah, right. Hence the name. Anyway, if you'd like to say a few things, we would welcome it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening and good morning, dear colleagues. I just would like to thank you, Dr. Oshel, for this wonderful opportunity that you gave to the Georgian scholars and scientists and professionals to attend the mini course series. I've attended all of them. I'm sorry to be late today. We had an event where I had to be. And I would like to thank our today's speakers, Ms. Comperda and Ms. Quintero, for wonderful presentations. And Brianna's work is really impressive. What she has done at SDSU Georgia with the students, we see already through the graduates, and we really appreciate her great work. And of course, I would like to thank Dr. Halil Guven for his really excellent work with the San Diego State University Georgia programs. And I'm very glad to hear there will be certificates that the participants of mini course series will receive. And I just would like to wish you all health. And of course, I joined the announcement about the importance of vaccination. I cannot stress it enough. So I hope we will all get vaccinated soon, the ones who didn't have an opportunity, and by fall we can go back to normal, hopefully. So all the best to you, dear colleagues, and again, thank you for everything you've done through this wonderful project that's funded by U.S. Embassy. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. I would like to turn over now to Dr. Nodar Sergaletsi, also with the Millennium Foundation, involved in tertiary education. Nodar, could you handle the discussion period and questions and answers?
Yes, thank you. I had a chance to communicate with Dr. Comperda in person, and I sent the few questions submitting during her presentation. Regis, please, floor is yours.
Sure. Just start from the first set of questions. So a couple of them were related to the studies I had shown about the state of replication and reproducibility in science. So the main one, in terms of showing that a lot of the results they were not able to reproduce, that they found that they got less statistical significance, lower effect size. The question was related to why. So what do we think is causing the inability to replicate the science? And in general, I don't think there's one conclusion, right? So the conclusion of the authors is that it's almost a death by 1,000 cuts, in the sense that there are a lot of small places for research to go wrong, and a lot of small details that may not be fully communicated that results in not having enough information to be able to replicate things authentically. There's also the fact that these psychology studies are typically done on people, right? So you're surveying them, or you're having some sort of intervention, and even just the change in time, right? So it's many years later that you're doing the study, or maybe you're doing it at a slightly different school with a slightly different type of students, makes it harder to replicate than something that you're potentially doing like in a chemistry lab on a benchtop, where you have a little bit more control over your chemicals and your equipment and things. So I don't necessarily think the takeaway that, well, psychology is broken is the right one. It's just that maybe it's more complicated, and maybe there shouldn't be such an incentive to get excited about the results from a single study, right? Maybe we should wait until we have more evidence, more people replicating studies, before we start to draw conclusions about this is definitely a thing that happens. And unfortunately, that's just not really the norms, right? People get excited about single studies that show very flashy results. And I think a lot of this work has just shown that that's really not science, right? Science should be a body of evidence, and we need to incentivize people to do these replication studies to create that body of evidence. So I think that was their general takeaway for kind of what the underlying causes might be of the lack of ability to do the replications.
Regis, I'm a real proponent of reporting negative results or null results, but a lot of people aren't. They're discouraged if they disprove their hypothesis, and I think that's just as important as finding a positive result. But I'm wondering how much of this is due to the fact that people only report positive results, and there's variation, and there's you'll get a false positive, some percentage of the time, and so those are being reported and then not substantiated. What do you think?
100%. Yeah. And so the cute term for this is the file drawer effect, which is if it didn't work, I put it away in my files and I don't tell anybody about it, right? I'm only going to tell you if it worked. And this is what the Open Science Initiative, the pre-registration, all of this is trying to avoid, and trying to get the idea that if you plan to do the experiment, you should tell us about the experiment, whether it worked or not. Mm-hmm. And some of that change absolutely is the individual scientists, right? That we just all need to learn to report everything that happens. But some of that has to be up at the higher levels, right? That has to be the journal editors, that has to be the funding agencies. There has to be a shift in the culture so that everyone recognizes the benefits and the importance of this. And I think we're getting there, right? I see a lot of positives in this push for open science, but like all cultural shifts, I think it's going to take some time to get everyone on board.
I have one more question, yes, if I may. Thank you very much, first of all, for an interesting session. In research methodology, generally, the way we defended our dissertation, the way we supervise our PhD students, there is a big piece of advice regarding having qualitative and quantitative types of research both at the same time. However, there are disciplines where qualitative methods do give you more than just simple statistics. Is there any shift these days towards not having statistical side at all, or diminish its part and put more emphasis on like interview results or narrative, even transcript analysis, etc., etc., etc.? Thank you.
That's a great question. And I wish there was more acceptance of that. As I said, my research is education research, so I do spend a lot more time dealing with qualitative data than my colleagues in the chemistry department. And I know that sometimes, when I go to give seminars in chemistry departments, even I get a lot of pushback, like, well, you just talked to people. That's not real data. Why should I believe, like, what am I supposed to do with that? So I do think there's an underlying attitude that numbers are somehow better, or numbers are somehow more true. And I think that's this other culture shift we need to happen. Is there's nothing inherently better about a number. There's a lot of ways numbers can be bad too. They can be used badly, they can be collected badly, they can be interpreted badly. And this is where like that whole pipeline is really important, is if you can demonstrate the quality of any data you have, that should be the standard, not what kind of data it is, but how you've collected it, how you've treated it, and how you're drawing conclusions from it.
And how you prove during the defense stage what
Yeah.
you had collected is something that's for you a piece of very good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree.
There were some other questions as well. Could you please take a look?
I think I've got one more question about the results. So this one was the survey results. The question is, why were the responses to the survey much more than 100%? And that's just because the survey respondents could select as many of the reasons they thought. So I'm sure you had people saying, well, I think selective reporting is a problem. I think, pressure to publish is a problem. So that's why it basically like a lot of people were endorsing a lot of the things because they were. And that again just speaks to this idea that there's a whole set of underlying conditions that are causing some of the issues with reproducibility. If there was a single thing, we probably would have been able to fix it a lot faster, but it's really a bigger kind of incentive system. What are you getting supported to do? And that's why it really encourages me that the funding agencies are realizing this, and the funding agencies are asking people to talk about how they're going to be transparent, how they're going to share these things, so that we're planning our studies with that from the beginning.
Regis, I think you said that fraud wasn't very important, but I think it was 40% was primary fraud and 40% contributing. That seems like a big number to me.
So that's not like shown fraud. That's people perceiving that fraud is an issue. And I guess I was saying that relative to some of the other things, it wasn't rated as highly. And yeah, I am in no way saying that like everyone is completely blameless. There have been a lot of studies. There was a food science professor, I want to say like Brian Wozniak, and it was found that like basically all of his data was fabricated. He was just making up things because he knew if he published interesting studies, he was going to get famous. But my overall view of humanity is that that's not the majority of what's happening. Most scientists are doing science because they want to make the world a better place. They are trying to do good research. There are just things standing in their way. But yes, there is probably some level of fraud, and the transparent science practices that help us, all do better science should also help kind of remove these people from the pool as well.
Yeah, by the way, I have the same view as you, and I certainly hope that fraud is a very minor component in our community, because I don't see any other reason for doing research than to find the truth, right? To get an answer and learn something new. And if you're fabricating results, you can't do that.
And it jeopardizes your whole career, right? Like we are not getting rich and famous doing science, right? So why would you put your whole career at risk just for a flashy headline? Let's see.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
No, I was just going to thank you for that.
Okay, next question is about what happens if you're doing like a series of papers and you're worried that publishing your data intermediate, I think the idea is that it might let other people scoop you, right? That's a problem. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on, can you like compartmentalize your data? Is it possible to just publish the data that you need to support the first paper instead of publishing your full data set? Like, is that something that you can do? Or, in my field, there's really no way to scoop someone. It doesn't move fast enough. It's really not an issue. So I think our field is going to be more likely to embrace data sharing relative to some other fields where that is definitely a problem. And that's why a lot of this is kind of field by field. And you want to see what other people are doing and what level other people are sharing at.
Yeah, I think that, if you're doing a long-term data set on the effect of climate change on anything, right? Pollination or you may be able to publish along the way, but if you're publishing that data and you have a high standard, you feel you need 20 years of data to sort of analyze and report, and somebody else in the community feels that 15 years is fine, you're in bad shape, right? And so, I think this open access to data has many good aspects, and many studies they're done and they're finished, right? And if that data can be made available, but there are other studies that's not the case. And I think we're not recognizing that sufficiently, maybe.
I do think there's, no one is necessarily asking you to share the data until you've published everything out of it that you want to.
No, I'm sorry, but the agencies they're requiring it.
Yes. And so but that's the thing that I think we also need to think about as scientists is I know it feels like our data, but we didn't pay for it, right?
In many cases we did. In many cases, the data continuity has been done during gaps in federal funding.
And I think that's what the agencies are going to have to deal with, right? Like what portion of the data do they actually get to claim ownership for?
Well, they feel all of it.
Yeah. And I mean, I think none of this is set in stone, right? Standards will continue to change over time. And I think those are important conversations to be having, with your funding agency, that I'm comfortable making this available, but I'm not comfortable making this other stuff available because you didn't help me collect it, right? Let's see. Just a couple other questions about kind of helping people choose research instruments. That is 100% what I do in a chemistry education context, so very specific, but I'm happy to talk more about that to anyone who's interested. You can get in touch with me. Typical mistakes graduate students make. Honestly, this is the same mistake I make, is when you write things up, because you have lived through the research, there's a lot of things in it that are obvious to you that you wouldn't think to write down because it's just how you always do something, or it's a method that makes sense to you. And I think this is a lot of the problem with replication studies, is the methods just don't have enough detail, right? They made sense to you and to your group, but they don't necessarily make sense to someone outside the group. And this is why I'd like to see more peer review that actually asks people to do the methods, not just read them, but actually try them to better point out where are the gaps, what might not make sense to another researcher. And I think that's the number one thing, is it makes sense in your head, but being able to clearly communicate that so someone else can actually walk through all of the steps. I think that's related to, how they do the methodology. The more detailed, the better. And if the journal editor gets mad at you, put it in the supplemental. But I think it's always better to err on the side of too much detail. And I cannot tell you how valuable it has been for myself and for my own students to see someone else's published research, and then they've got all of the analysis and the data there, and we can run it. And it's like, it's a training method for them, right? Like now the students actually get a chance to practice on real authentic data because someone was nice enough to put all of that into their supporting information. So again, I think this communal aspect, this sharing, really has a lot of benefits at a lot of places along the way. And I'm not sure I understand the last one. Can citation include the article in the preprint? I don't know if someone wants to ask me that.
I think this main reason was that can you cite the article that is only in preprint version, not the published yet? So what kind of scientific value it might have? Because at the end, it might not be published at all.
Correct. Yeah, so you can. So when you deposit your paper on these preprint servers, you get the DOI, the little hyperlink, that permanent object identifier, just like you would for a journal article. So you can absolutely cite it in the same way. And that is also your record of the timing, right? Because if you publish your results on the preprint server in January, and then someone comes along and does another paper in March, you can say, look, my results were there first. Even if it's not a formal journal, you at least have that timestamp. Now, you do have to be careful with the quality of what's in a preprint, right? Because it doesn't go through the same peer review, but there are ways for people to read your work there, and you definitely get that credit for it. When you deposit it into the preprint server, you do get that link and that citation you can use.
Thank you. For me personally, it was quite a surprise to find out that recently European journals requesting kind of data management plan, which is not common, was not common in US.
Yeah.
So this was something new that I learned. And you just provided the citation from Nature series of the journals, which with all respect, not many junior authors can afford for. So they are usually hunting for journals with the impact factors from 1 to 5 max for the PhD students. So for them, they are very faint kind of regulation related to the methodology and description of the methodology, although many journals require specific aspects of the description. So this was kind of
No, that's a fair point. And the reason I wanted to highlight like nature journals, right, is because I think a lot of other journals are going to look to them. Like, what are they doing? Now we are going to, design what we want, based on that. And a lot of what we do when we publish is we kind of shoot for the moon first,
Yes,
knowing it's
and
not going to happen. Right.
Yeah.
So I'll at least try to meet those standards. And then if that doesn't work, at least I've already like gone above and beyond. And so that was kind of the reason for showing you like, what are the top level people looking for? That should be like your above the bar goal. And then you'll have to see, like what your specific journals are asking for. But I think things are moving in that direction. I think the European model is actually moving much faster than the US in terms of requiring a lot of specifics in the data management plans. So I think it's good practice to start doing it now.
Thank you very much. I think everyone enjoyed the presentation. This is what they sent me in personal and direct messages. Thank you very much. I hope that your presentation will be available for the audience. And if you can send the presentation, we will highly appreciate that. For the Brianna, I should say that for 5 years already that I witnessed the magic transformation of SDSU students. So when they become a freshman, all of them have a very good knowledge of physics, chemistry, and other stuff, but they lack the presentation skills. And the San Diego does a very good job, and they form a new generation of Georgians with the relevant skills to working industry. And proof for that is the capstone project with Eyewitness, and I'm together with Halil are in the jury of evaluation. They are doing an amazing job, and all of the industry representatives are willing to have them as their employees. And mainly this comes from the communication lectures that Brianna does for others. And this is why I strongly encourage all of our partner university representatives to include as many general education courses in their curricula for the joint degree programs, because this really helps to shape and to form the critical thinking and the communication skills. So, and Brianna is in charge for developing this general education courses with our partner universities, and I hope very soon we will have these courses already articulated. Halil, would you like to add anything on that?
Well, I would like to concur with you that the last evidence of that was the presentation 2 students made at the Walter Reed Army Research Institute, Lugar Center. So every summer we have 2 interns there, and Nora and I were in their presentation last week, and it was amazing. And they started with a joke, and then they went more than 2 minutes, but then afterwards, ambassador and others approached them and said, "This is unbelievable. How can you speak English so well? And you're better than the students in the main campus." And they said, "We took a course from Brianna." So they said, we have a roadmap. So now that I know what they're talking about, because they talked about the roadmap of their speech. So that must have been the one that you showed, Brianna. So maybe you can share your presentation as well. So I would like to recognize again Brianna's fabulous job in Georgia in transforming Georgian kids that, of course, admittedly, they're quite bright. We get the best of the Georgian entrance exam. We get the top scorers. But from the time that they enter as a freshman and by the time they're ready to graduate, or even before when they're juniors, the transformation is unbelievable. And I am shocked myself reading their essays and presentations. So presentation skill is probably the single most thing that can move someone's career further. So having a story to tell, having good research results is of course important, but if you cannot tell a story from that, if you cannot present it in an effective way, you don't get full credit for it. So telling your story and having a story to tell, even if you are Einstein, you will not get funded unless you can tell a story about it and you can communicate it. So this lecture is very important, and I enjoyed it a lot. I missed the first portion, so I'll go back and watch it on recordings. Dr. Comperda's presentation. And again, I'd encourage you to go back and check the website. Anna Tonikiani shared the website on chat where all the recordings are, but maybe we can send email to all the participants of the 5 mini-series and remind them to complete their certificate, complete their courses, and
Sure.
And then we can, by end of August, we can complete this portion of the mini-series and start a new one in the next fall. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you, Halil. Thanks again, Regis and Brianna, for great presentations. Really appreciate it. I look forward to the presentations of certificates in September. That might be a good time to try and get the speakers. The speeches were intended to be live in Georgia before COVID. And we haven't discussed this internally, but I would like to consider bringing all the speakers over for the awarding of the certificates, and maybe a panel discussion and some public lectures in September. And so we can at least explore that and see if that's possible. Thank you all. Have a good rest of your summer, and thanks for your attention and participation.
Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, we will see you.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.